Good morning, everyone. I'm Fenwick Huss, Dean of the Zicklin School of Business, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Today, our topic is the dark side of social media. Joining me from the Dean's office is Gwen Webb, Associate Dean for Executive Education, who will moderate the question and answer period. Today in conversation, we're delighted to welcome Isaac Vaghefi, who is an Assistant Professor of Information Systems here in the Zicklin School. And joining him is Niam, Yaraghi, who is an Assistant Professor at the University of Miami's Business School. Leading the conversation is Larry Zicklin, former chairman of Neuberger Berman, an alum and our benefactor. And I'm also very proud to say that Larry teaches in many of our programs. Larry?
Thank you very much, Dean Huss. Before we get on the subject of the dark side of social media, I'm interested in how each of you, Isaac and Niam, got into this profession that you're in. Could you spend a couple of minutes just telling us, and then we'll get on to social media?
Sure, I can start. So yeah, I got into dark side of technology use in general, specifically social media, as part of my PhD program at the time at McGill University. We applied for a grant with the help of my supervisor and a couple of other professors, and also we had a visiting scholar from USC, a well-known neuroscientist, and we looked at addiction. And at the time, we were just starting to explore internet addiction, digital addiction. And then once we got that that grant, we kind of delved into this for a couple of years. We did the studies on social media, video game addiction, and smartphone addiction.
So you were early in the game. How about you, Niam?
Hello, everyone. I think my story is very similar to Isaac's. I also got involved with this line of research during my PhD program when I got teamed up with a group of other researchers to look at the impact of social media activities during the Arab Spring on offline activities. So we were trying to map what happens online, but what happens offline, and see if there is any significant association between them. I also think the other reason that I got really interested in social media is because of my interest in First Amendment issues and freedom of speech and how that impacts our society. And these platforms have become the very prominent platforms when you were about to do anything with First Amendment and freedom of expression and speech. So because of my interest in that domain, these platforms logically become quite important and interesting for me.
Well, we're going to get into a little of this. So let me begin. We're calling it the dark side of social media. How deep is the dark side? How dark is the dark side? And how do you know? Isaac, you want to get started on this?
Yeah, I can provide a partial response to that. So based on my research and most of the work I have done, I have focused on the individual. I know that Niam has a broader perspective on this, but what I looked at was mostly looking at what could use of social media do to individuals. So over time, I've looked at different behaviors. It might be called compulsion. Some people might call it even an addiction. Some people might call it obsessive compulsive disorders. And when we, by referring to these behaviors, basically we are looking at the consequence of social media use on personal life. So there has been abundant research I would say, for the past 10 years that provides proof that the use of social media, not regular social media use, but I would say excessive social media use, can generate some negative outcomes, let's say, on individuals' well-being. So for instance, we might experience higher anxiety or even higher level of depression or social anxiety, or even higher social isolation, which is kind of counterintuitive because we think we're more social because we're all connected online. But in reality, actually, studies have shown that we might be more isolated physically because of the lack of access or lack of interaction with other people. At the same time, use of social media definitely can have some outcomes on individuals' performance, productivity, it will increase distractions, and those can actually reduce our professional, I would say, well-being over time. And like there's been a studies done, for instance, even look at students that higher use of social media can have a negative correlation with their GPA. Same results with like excessive use of social media at work. It will reduce your work productivity, which is not what has been
Niam, you look at it a little differently, don't you?
I do, and my perspective is more at the higher level and looks at the impact of these platforms on our society and politics. And you asked, what is the dark side, or how deep is the dark side of the social media? And I think to a large extent, we don't know, because we never considered these technologies to be able to have the impact that they have. I highly doubt that even the founders of these platforms, if you talk with Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, when back in the day when they first generated these ideas and started building these platforms, they could ever dream that their product is going to become so big and it's going to have such large impact on politics, on society, and the everyday life of so many people, not only in the United States, but across the world. So these platforms have so quickly morphed into very important tools that without us having enough time to look into their unintended consequences. So I would say that there are a lot of impacts. I think now we are aware of the impact of social media on a lot of negative things among young adults, for example, as Isaac alluded to. There are a lot of impacts on how our society works, on how we engage in national discussions about very important issues, and how our opinions are being formed. There are also some potentially negative impacts on even cases of national security, as I hope we can have the time to discuss it. So I would say it seems like the dark side is quite deep, and unfortunately we haven't had the opportunity to carefully examine it yet.
And who spends the most time on social media? And how do you know?
I mean, there are surveys, there are reports. I think it's kind of a bell curve. So the younger individuals tend to spend a lot of time on it. And it kind of goes down as people, I would say, enter the workforce, and it goes back up again. I think for older generation, like people who are retired, they also tend to engage quite a bit in social media. So that's what we know about it.
How do you measure these things? Do you just survey them, or do you actually check their phones and find out when they're on, when they're not on? How is this actually done? And does engagement with social media mean I'm actually on, or I'm just touching my phone, checking something for a second and going back off? What's the methodology? How do you really know?
So I think there are two ways of looking at this. The one way is to look at it from the perspective of the user, and there you can do a lot of, for example, surveys and ask people how many hours do you spend on Twitter, or how many times do you guess you're touching your phone. You may also be able to install some apps that collects that data automatically, removing a lot of measurement errors. On the other hand, I think an easier, more reliable way is to listen to these social media companies, because they do track their users' activity and they do track their users' engagement, and they publicly report these data because they are publicly traded companies. So if you go on, Twitter reports, annual reports, they will tell you exactly, say, how many hours on average their users spend on Twitter, or what are statistics on different metrics of engagement, say how much time they retweet, what is the likelihood that they like a tweet, and what is, say, the immediate action after seeing a particular tweet Do they go open up YouTube to search for that topic, or are they going to search in Google, or are they just going to close their phone and go do something else? So I would say that these are the two ways that you would be able to collect that data, and that is how researchers would know the extent to which people are using these social media platforms.
So if young people and older retired people are on more frequently than others, and that makes all kinds of sense, are they necessarily the victims of this attention to social media? Is the amount of time you spend equal to your victimhood?
I mean, it's not necessarily the amount of time. In actually my recent paper that just got published, we do talk about this, that it's not just the amount of time. Amount of time could be a good determinant, but for a behavior to be considered problematic in general, we usually look at if it does diminish some aspects of their life, let's say their well-being, or does it have an effect? Again, I mentioned the professional performance, or it might interfere with their social relationships. So you might have seen that, for instance, parents might yell at their kids because they're using their phone at the dinner table all the time, or friends go out and everybody's on their smartphone. So unless we see that there are consequences on some aspects of one's life, we can't really call it problematic. And the reason is because a lot of people might work on social media. Their job might be related to, let's say, spending time on social media or engagement with social media, or your job is to increase brand awareness. So you might be using social media a lot, but by itself, it's not a good determinant of whether it's going to be a problem for you or not. So that's the thing.
And tell me this, I want to concentrate on young people for a moment. For the young people who are one of the prime audiences for social media, how many hours a day are they really on? And how many times a day might they be touching their iPhone or cell phone of some sort?
I mean, I can just give you some of the numbers that people have reported in my work. Yeah, I mean, when we say problematic, I've had people that report between like 2 to even like 8 or sometimes even 10 hours a day. And in terms of touching, it's really a lot. I think the average number of times we touch our smartphone is about 250 a day. So for people who are problematic, we're talking about like maybe over 1,000. So it's
1,000 times a day.
At least, yeah.
I mean, to me, that is an absolutely shocking number. 1,000. Although I must admit, I check my pocket every day when I leave home to make sure I have my phone in it. And when I find sometimes that my phone's not there, I get a little upset. So I know the feeling. Is it social media itself that's the problem? Or is it our own self-discipline and the way we use it? Is it an asset that we can use properly and it's our own weakness? Or is there something in social media that seduces us?
I think it is a combination of both. So from the perspective of the social media companies, they are designed to be as addictive as possible, because at the end of the day, that engagement metric, which is a very nice way to say addiction level of users, is what translates to dollars for them. So social media companies or social media platforms are doing everything that they can in order to make their product more appealing to users, in order to increase their engagement, which is basically so that the user spends more time on the platform, which means in plain English, they're trying to make their users addicted. On the other hand, as Isaac was mentioning, this is a super powerful tool, and it could be used to your benefit. So if you are a person who generates content on social media, which then can translate it to, say, professional and career advancements, then it is the best tool that you have. As a professor, one of the things that I try to do is to create videos on YouTube. So I teach machine learning, and I create short videos that talk about different algorithms in machine learning. and I post them on YouTube, and then I try to tweet about them. I try to talk about them on LinkedIn. I try to use the powers of this phenomenon tool that we have at our fingertips in order to help my students first, and also, myself as a professor. However, there are a lot of cases that this tool could unintentionally be abused by people without them even understanding how they are hurting themselves with this. And one prime example of that, again, is going to be, say, teenagers or young adults, or even, professional adults who are spending way too much on this platforms and getting angry, getting anxious about things that they would have very little control
of. Are little children using it too? 6, 7, 8-year-olds?
I mean, probably they don't really report those numbers, because I think for most social media, you should be over 12. But I mean, there's a lot of ways you can get around it. And now Facebook came up with the idea of, I think Facebook for Kids, about last year, this time, that they were trying to encourage it for younger individuals to be able to use these platforms. And they advertise it under parent supervision. But again, the idea is that get them hooked early and make sure that they're on it,
And the same goes for YouTube. They also have a YouTube Kids version. And I've seen a lot, this is very anecdotal example, but I've seen a bunch of my, friends' children who are like 9 or 10 years old. They have their own Instagram accounts. So anecdotally, I see a lot of younger children are using it, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are statistics about it. However, you wouldn't expect the social media companies to announce these statistics, because they're legally, are supposed to ban the user. So expecting Facebook to tell you how many underage users they have is like expecting Philip Morris to tell you how many underage smokers they're selling cigarettes to. So there are some anecdotal evidence, but I think reliable statistics on that is very difficult to come by.
Are girls more likely to use it than boys in these teenage, young adult years?
I mean, on average, I think I also have seen it in my research. When you look at the demographics, it's usually more female that show kind of problematic use tendencies. I don't know exactly what would be the justification for this, but that's certainly the trend that has been reported over time for both young and also older adults. But like female users are more likely to develop an addiction.
And I've seen some news articles that young girls start to compare themselves to ideals on the internet and wind up with all kinds of psychological issues. Mm-hmm. Is that part of your research?
Yeah, I mean, I do look at a broad range of psychological, disorders that might be associated with excessive use of technology. And that's also another reason when we're talking about, let's say, younger or adolescents or younger individuals, and we don't really want them to be on it that early. And the reason is because like the younger you are, you're in the development phase. So like a lot of your habits, a lot of the way your brain works is going to be influenced based on what you do and what the habits that you have. Let's say if you have someone that has a habit of reading books for long hours growing up, for that person, the ability to be able to focus and let's say, think longer for on a specific issue is going to be a lot more likely than, let's say, someone who has a habit of like constantly checking social media. And again, think about social media and the content we see on social media. We see a large variety of topics, all in short excerpts, very frequently, and some would be, let's say, if we're talking about an average person, you might see stuff about celebrities and football games and world politics and presidential election, if that's coming. So you see, again, a large frequency of articles that are not really related to each other. So what it does to your brain is that it makes you create this habit of constantly changing between topics that are like really short or like brief in focus. So you don't really go deep in any of them, but you kind of get a lot of information about little things. So your brain gets constantly activated and kind of craves, because all of these, we can think of it as a dopamine being released in your brain, right? So you get a hit. So the more you see it, you want to.
Is it a real dopamine hit?
100%, yeah. That's been proven by hundreds of studies now have been done by neuroscientists. Some of them are my colleagues, fMRI studies that show that when you see a notification or when you see a buzz on your phone, there is a dopamine release. It's very comparable to the effect of when you take it, like, let's say, when you're having a cigarette, or in like extreme cases when people use addictive drugs. So it's comparable. Maybe it's not to that extent, but it is very much comparable.
And when I see young children on their cell phones playing games of one sort or another, I mean, really young children, 5, 6 years old, is that the beginning of an addiction, do you think?
I wouldn't be surprised if it is. Again, these are the most resourceful companies that we've seen on the face of planet Earth.
Better than tobacco?
They are more resourceful.
Better than Las Vegas, probably. Yeah.
And what they are doing is that they are using all of those resources to hire the brightest minds ever in order to help them make their product as addictive as possible. So I would say that is the logical expectation that I have from these products. They have to be addictive. If I were an investor, and the only principle that I had would have been the economic gain, I would be looking at these. I would be talking with the founders and engineers to figure out which of them can create a more addictive product, and would invest on that. The same way, if I were investing on, say, cigarette companies, I'd go with the one that puts a larger amount of nicotine in its products to make sure that, if you get hooked on my cigarettes, you're going to be hooked on for life. I don't want to go invest in a cigarette company that creates cigarettes that are non-addictive. And that is the ugly truth.
It's interesting. I remember when I was involved in some way with research on tobacco, and I discovered that tobacco customers are the most loyal customers there are. They don't change brands. Once they're hooked on something, going back to what you said, they stay on that brand. That's interesting. And Isaac, you made reference to Las Vegas, and I couldn't help thinking that if you look at some of these games and the things that are on social media, I'm talking about for children now, it reminds me of Las Vegas and the lights and the flashing and the numbers appearing before you and changing. Is that part of the addiction?
Totally. I mean, the combination of colors and sounds and the movements, they're all part of the process that make someone want to be hooked on something. So traditionally, I mean, when I look at research that was done on like, let's say, gambling addiction, like 30 years ago, people were looking at slot machines and the colors and the sound of the machine. But you can't compare that to a video game. That's lively, very good quality, constantly improving. We now have like actors being the voice actor for these games. So again, as Niam mentioned, these companies are spending millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars in order to develop these games. So unfortunately, there's so much resources in this. And if you want to think about it, I mean, we call this attention economy. Well, why do we call it attention economy? Because they crave our attention. The more time we spend on it, it means more advertising. There's one goal for all of these companies, which is to expose people to advertising. And that only can be done by the amount of time people spend on these platforms, right? So their job is to get people hooked, make people spend more time on it. I mean, as a couple of years ago, I was collaborating with this research lab in California, and they were getting projects, multi-million-dollar projects from Facebook, and their job was just to look at the combination of colors or the sequence of, let's say, pictures and contents, and what would be the best way to present these contents to the user and their ultimate goal was like, we want to make sure that people stay on the platform rather than closing it and putting it away. So they want to do it. Again, going back to, again, younger individuals, the reason why these companies want to get them early is the same thing. It's like tobacco. If you have people on Facebook young, let's say Facebook kids, when they're older, they're more likely to continue using Facebook rather than dropping it. It's very, very similar process.
And I think another very good example of this is investing apps, say Robinhood. They had a lawsuit that accused them that they are putting the benefits of their users in the back row seat, because the way that they've designed their platform, they designed it in order to be like a game. So when, for example, you make a trade, there is like a splashes of color and vibration and sound in order to make you happy that, oh my gosh, you made a trade. And at the same time, rather than providing you with some detailed, useful information to help you make a good economic decision about your trading, they're just going to make it so that you are as likely as possible to just hit that button that says trade, because that is how they make money. They make the money on the spread. So the more frequently you trade, the more money that they are going to make. And I think if you have the slightest idea of how markets work, you would know that the more frequently you trade, the less likely it is that you're going to make money over a long term. The other example, again, with Robinhood is when you look at their interface for cryptocurrency trades. That is even worse because it's available 24/7, 7 days a week. And when you go there, it's like the background is like pumping, like a heartbeat. And it's just enticing and encouraging and welcoming you to go and put that and trade in order to buy some Dogecoin or Ethereum or whatever it is there to buy, again, without the least amount of required information for the user to be able to make a meaningful decision. And well, to their defense, they're saying they're democratizing investment and providing a platform for everybody to be able to enter the stock market and cryptocurrency markets. But on the other hand, you compare that platform, say, with Merrill Edge or with Charles Schwab or any other brokerage, and you would immediately understand the difference in the level of information provided to the user to make a better decision, and check marks that are put in place. So sometimes when I want to make a trade, they don't allow me. My brokerage does not allow me and says that, this is outside of the usual trades you make. Are you sure you want to make this trade? And then they send me a text and I have to respond to the code. So they're like some hurdles intentionally put in place to prevent me from making trades that may be emotional rather than rational. Whereas those never exist on Robinhood, which is designed with this gamification theory in mind in order to make it more like a game and less like a rational investment.
Well, let me push you a little bit on this, but it reminds me, this is probably why the meme stocks were created, because there's this hurdle. I always remember, and this is response to you, Niam. I remember an old mentor of mine who once said, you can always tell a trader by his frayed cuffs. I never forgot that lesson. So let me ask you, I don't know your personal lives, but if I'm not delving too deeply into your personal lives, if you have children, how do you handle your own children?
I mean, by setting limitations, you want to constantly limit and supervise, especially in younger age. Again, I'm talking about like developing good habits for our children. So as much as possible, you want to limit, the time they have on a screen, for sure. Again, watching shows, playing video games. And for me personally, just avoid, don't let them get on social media, and try to drag it as much as possible. Obviously, it's not possible to do it forever, but again, you don't need to encourage it because, again, the gains, obviously social media have benefits. I mean, this is a disclaimer probably we should have discussed at the beginning. We're not against social media. We all know the goods of social media. Niam talked about, let's say, the benefit of LinkedIn for professional development, finding contacts, getting jobs. So no one's really denying all that. But again, for younger generation and for which is most likely to produce entertainment, maybe the side effects might outweigh the benefits that you're getting. So I would just say delay the game as much as possible and definitely supervise.
And I'm assuming you're a good role model for your kids. When you talk to them, you're not fingering a phone while you're talking to them.
I might, but I'm trying not to.
And I agree with Isaac, especially on the point that the children learn way more through indirect observation of their parents. So what you do is going to be what they are going to do, whether you like it or not. And another perspective that I've heard is that you should educate your children and allow them to make that decision themselves. And the example that was given was that the Twitter today or TikTok today is like the rock and roll back in the days that, parents were paranoid about the impact that it may have on children. And, Elvis Presley was ruining their kids and how dangerous it is. And now we know that it was not as dangerous as people thought. And you could not shield your kids away from the reality of life. So it's better to allow them to have an experience with this thing that, whether you like it or not, it's going to be out there in the world, and you better empower your kids to be able to deal with it. I don't think that it works as easily as it did in the case of, say, rock and roll out there, because the way that I view them, especially based on the discussion that we have about the addictive aspect of these technologies and the high negative risk that they may have on children, especially like a 9-10-year-old kid, that it is, I think, rational if, as a parent, you educate yourself first. And once you have that education, then you try to limit it as much as possible. So there are some bad things in the world that we understand and say that, okay, there's bullying in the world, right? Mm-hmm. I cannot completely shield my children from being bullied, but I try to educate them so that they understand what is the right behavior and how they should react when there is somebody bullying. And obviously they should never bully anybody. Mm-hmm. But there are also cocaine out there in the world. I don't let my daughter use cocaine, even if she wants to, even if I educate her a lot. I don't even educate her on it. I don't even let her know about this. And an example I can give you is about Coke, Diet Coke or Pepsi. My daughter is 5 years old. She doesn't know that exists in the world. She has no idea whatsoever that there is a drink called Coca-Cola. Interestingly, and so it's weird to me that she never figured it out, even at school. So we thought that, look, this thing is so addictive that when you put yourself in the shoes of a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, Coca-Cola, if you taste it once, it's impossible to get away from. So no matter how much you educate them, no matter how much you tell them it's going to ruin your teeth, it's bad for your health, and no matter how many incentives you put there in order to stop them from drinking. So it is much, much, much easier from a parent's perspective to just delay their exposure to this thing as long as possible. Rather than saying, okay, Coca-Cola is out there, she will drink it eventually, so let me give her a taste and stuff like that. So I am leaning more towards, just preventing it as much as possible.
Niam, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You talked about national security. My impression of the dark side of social media is that whatever we believe, this leads us to a greater extreme of that belief. And I think about that in connection with January 6th. Mm-hmm. What were you referring to when you talked about national security?
So I completely agree with you. The way that these social media platforms work, it's the best example that I can give is that they create very, very strong magnetic fields that as soon as you enter them, it is pretty much impossible to stay in the center. And instead, you will be pulled to either of the extreme very quickly because the two ends are very, very powerful. So January 6th was a good example. Like we saw that. I think it was it Parler, the social media platform that had a big role in creating that. So that is one example. The other example that I can give you is about TikTok. And this is the interesting thing about it. All of these social media platforms, as we know them, at least so far, are either American or created by vendors and creators in the West. They follow certain value systems, and also they provide access to the Western governments. So, for example, if there is January 6th and the law enforcement wants to know, what is going on, it is much easier to get that information from Twitter than it is to get it from another social media platform that is not based in the US, is not founded by the US, and may even be funded by governments that are not necessarily in best terms with the US. So if there was this social media company that was based in Canada, and maintained by a Canadian company under the rules and regulation of Canada, I think it is way easier for the US law enforcement to collaborate with them than an alternative that maybe somewhere else outside of the United States that puts a lot more barriers for law enforcement to look under the hood and be able to analyze things. The other aspect of it is, again, the influence that these platforms have in shaping opinions of young minds. So you keep that on one hand, and on the other hand, you realize the amount of usage of these platforms and prevalence of usage of these platforms among younger adults in your country, and then you would be hesitant to whether or not allowing these platforms have unprecedented access to your minds is the best decision in the long term or not. So my research, for example, was looking at how Twitter could be used in order to push social change in Egypt, right? So what happened was the Arab Spring. It was a movement that was in line with Western values. It was supported by Western countries, and it was facilitated in part by Twitter, which is a Western company. Well, what makes you believe that the same kind of social influence cannot be exerted through similar apps in the United States? It could be.
I got it. So then I want to push you again, and maybe Isaac, you would cut in on this. If social media shapes young minds, and it's negatively influencing some young minds and some adolescents, and to say nothing of adults, it's been my experience that when that happens, government steps in some way to regulate. We see it in tobacco, we've seen it in gambling, we've seen it in liquor. Is government about to step in here to manipulate this in some way to save us from ourselves?
I mean, that's the hope. That's the hope we have, because again, as you mentioned, like any other industry, once the negative aspects or the outcomes come into light, we're expecting government to step in. There are some structural differences from social media, if you want to compare it. First of all, I would say social media use is a lot more prevalent than gambling or smoking. It's in your pocket, it's accessible. The barriers to entry is almost nothing. Second, it's also free. So let's say when we say tobacco, you could make it expensive, right? When you say gambling, you can set certain, let's say age limit. But for social media, again, there's almost not much you can control, because you can sign up for free, you can use it for free, and there again, a lot of ways you can get around the age limitations that these companies set. So there's almost no way to stop people from getting in. And also another issue is that we do hope that social media companies are good, and they, let's say when we talk about social responsibility, we're hoping that they're thinking about the benefits of the society, but there are a lot of signs that show that these companies might not take that into perspective. Let's say we had whistleblower last year, right? So Facebook whistleblower, the idea was that, like she was mentioning, that there was a team that has started to look at, let's say, some of the effect of use of Facebook on well-being, but then because it was against the main, let's say, focus of the company to generate more profit, that team was dismantled. So
she was fired, wasn't she?
Yeah. No, and also that team was dismantled. Like, I mean, it was ordered, they had a team in place and they had discussion, but again, they dismantled the team because they thought it's against their profit. So we can't really expect those companies to take responsibility. And this is why we need a little bit of government intervention. But again, from my understanding, unfortunately, I think the people who are trying to regulate it might not be able to totally understand it. So they're always playing a catch-up game because these companies are constantly changing, you know?
It's based on some knowledge I have. Most companies are not headquartered, but incorporated in Delaware, in the state of Delaware. Delaware law says that you have to, as part of your fiduciary responsibility, further the interests of the corporation. If you further the interests of the corporation, you probably want to secure more users and have them stay on longer. Why would any corporation cut its own throat by worrying about what it's doing to young children and teenagers? Seems to me it's contrary to why they're in business.
And you're right, and that is where the regulations come into the picture. Again, if I were making cigarettes, I would love to be able to advertise it everywhere. And the very first place that I would go is on YouTube Kids to advertise my cigarettes to kids, because it's much easier to sell to them than it is to sell to adults. And there are, regulations that make it illegal. So basically stop me from making money off of those particular ways. And that is where I think the importance of regulation comes into the picture. In addition to the hurdles that Isaac mentioned, why it is more difficult to regulate social media than, say, gambling or drinks or tobacco. I think the other thing is that social media, to a large extent, benefits from this First Amendment protection. So constitutionally justifying regulation of social media becomes a very convoluted area to navigate. So that is, again, something that legal scholars are way more qualified than I to opine on. But that adds another layer of complexity.
Well, liquor, tobacco, and gambling don't have First Amendment considerations.
Right.
But social media is all over the First Amendment. I mean, they plead the First Amendment every time there's a problem.
Exactly.
Well, then let me go back to what I asked you before about your own personal life. Why doesn't personal responsibility enter into this? People don't have to do this. Parents don't have to permit it. Why don't these companies have a good argument saying, nobody forces you to be on, you don't want to be on, don't be on?
I think the major thing is lack of awareness and knowledge. And this is the litmus test. Ask any parent, or just tell them what would they do if you told them that their 13-year-old or 14-year-old son was smoking cigarettes. They immediately go into action, or at least they show significant signs of concern. Now tell them that the same kid, the 14-year-old kid, is on Twitter or spends time on video games, which are, by the way, another form of social media these days, because they are much more group-based and people just, chat and communicate with each other. I would say a large number of those parents would say, so what? It's the things that kids do these days. It's normal. So awareness and knowledge is not there. And I think if the awareness was there, you would be able to solve a lot of these issues without even government intervention. Like right now, if the government said that, you know what, you can sell cigarettes to kids, I don't think that there's going to be a significant increase in the consumption of cigarettes by kids, not because of the regulations, but it's because the parents prohibit it.
It's also because it's $10 or $12 a pack.
Exactly. It's $10 or $12 a pack. So so awareness, I think, is a major issue, and that we have just started. Again, it goes back to the very first question that you asked, Larry, and that was, you know, how deep is this dark side of social media? And we don't know. We just started to realize. Nobody knew. You know, it's just something that exploded out of control very quickly.
But we know that the suicide rate among adolescents has increased dramatically. I don't know if there's a relationship between the suicide rate and social media, but there have been reports, especially of young women,
right,
who have committed suicide through anorexia or any other way, being deeply involved in social media and comparing themselves to others who obviously don't exist. They're idealized forms.
Yes.
I'm back to you. I'm not sure we know what we don't know.
Exactly. And I think the best advice, I mean, it's not an advice because it's a strong word, but what I do as a parent myself is to be very scary of this thing. It may have more benefits than risks, but we don't know. And I don't expose my kids to the things that I'm not sure about their benefits. You don't let your kid go. I mean, I'm in Florida, right? You don't let your kid go near the water that you're sure does not have alligators. You know, you don't risk it. You know, and if the water may have alligators, you know, or may not, and in those cases, if I'm not sure, I would stop her.
Would you like to see regulation that administered or oversaw the content when young children are likely to be on the internet?
Again, I'm not sure that could be done in a meaningful way. You know, again, because these tech companies are so ahead of the curve, and the government, by its nature, it's so backwards. They are going to always be playing catch-up games, and so the efficacy of those regulations seems very questionable to me. I haven't seen any solid proposals about how to do it, and I think it's because it's very difficult to do. And even if there were anything, I would be very suspicious of their effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it also is a combination of both regulation and also you always want to try to increase awareness in the society by advertisement, you know, like the way we were advertising against consumption of alcohol or smoking, or a simpler, like Niam had a good example about, like, let's say we're thinking about child safety. When we put a child in a car and the car seat and like how tight it should be, there's an increasing awareness, let's say compared to like 20, 30 years ago. We didn't know, or parents didn't used to care as much about this, but now we know about it. There's also government regulations. So a combination of like these two kind of helped remedy, let's say, the child safety. And this could be also another way we can look at the child safety, but child psychological safety or mental safety, where we can avoid a lot of issues, including cyberbullying. I mean, few of them, I would say we know, but I would say the negative effects can go deep. Anxiety, depression, envy, unnecessary envy, because as you mentioned, we don't know how people's lives look like. Or an influencer might take a nice picture of a vacation, but we don't actually know if they are rich, are they living luxury, how much is their income. It's just, they create a perception basically that creates that sense of jealousy. And all of these can negatively affect our child. If we know that our child's being bullied at school, we're going to step in quickly and do something about it. But if you don't know your child's being bullied online or being influenced by all these things, what can you do about it? So it's about awareness too.
It's interesting. It's all come down to this. I want to talk about transparency a little bit. You talked about national security, Liam. It seems to me a lot of the stuff I see on social media doesn't really describe who is making that available. It has a fancy title, the Organization for a Better America, or whatever it is. But the real people that are doing this are not included. Could that transparency help in this creating fake news, to use the expression fake news?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's a one positive thing that we've been bashing social media so much today, but to say some positive things to create a balance. Like on Twitter, I've noticed that there is a disclaimer that said this person, say, is a congressional candidate. The other very interesting thing that I see is that they say this reporter is associated with the Russian government, for example. So, take things with a grain of salt if it's about Ukraine, for example, the conflict about Ukraine, if a Russian affiliated journalist is talking about it. The other thing I've noticed is, for example, on YouTube, if you will watch content that are controversial, there are links to Wikipedia pages about that topic. So you would, so if you're watching a video about flat Earth, for example, there is a link to a Wikipedia page that talks about the fact that probably the Earth is not flat; it's a globe. And I think that's a very good thing. To highlight where the person is coming from is a very good thing. The other thing that you would see is this, blue check mark that Twitter puts on to give a little bit more credibility to the person that's talking, to say that this is a verified person talking about it. It's more difficult to peddle conspiracy theories if you're verified and a real person than it is to have a completely anonymous and fake identity on Twitter, for example.
I see Gwen in front of me. Gwen, I know, is going to be asking some questions also from our audience.
All right, thank you all. That was really interesting. And I always, as usual, I hate to interrupt. There are quite a few questions from the audience. One of them is the question, does social media provide a sense of false accomplishments?
I would say they do. And again, that is something that Isaac also mentioned, that if you look at brain images, you'd see the same parts in brain that, when you get cocaine, for example, get triggered. And it gives you a false sense of accomplishment because a lot of that's how they work. You tweet something in order to get as many likes and retweets as possible. That is going to give you a sense of accomplishment. But can you put that on your CV? Can you say that, oh, I made a tweet that got, 1,000 likes or 2,000 retweets? No. So it is a sense of accomplishment. The best example of it is in video games. Oh, you win a video game, right? So what? Can you get a McDonald's because you won a video game? No, you can't. So it really
what happens when you lose, or when you get a reaction to your tweet that is terribly negative? What happens to you then psychologically?
The reverse. You get a false sense of depression and loss and failure, which again, it really doesn't matter. If you're not good in a video game, it doesn't mean that you're not a smart person. It doesn't mean that you're not a kind person. But all of those feelings are going to be artificially generated inside of you.
Is that evident in your research, Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, there's a correlation between the number of likes and comments you might get on a topic, and I've seen the studies looking at life satisfaction or daily life satisfaction. So it does improve that. But again, as Niam said, like, can you translate that into, let's say, income or some sort of like other ways of a status? And this is interesting because I was having this discussion. So there's now a perception that influencers generate income and all that. But if you actually look at the number, there's a very, very small number of a small percentage of influencers who can actually make meaningful income out of social media. So a lot of people who spend time are not going to make almost any money out of it, like maybe like $50 for a post or advertising something. But again, it's almost it's almost never comparable with having a salaried job. So
Gwen, I interrupted you.
Yeah.
All right, here's another question for you, Niam and Isaac. In your discussion, you've covered a wide range of negative effects of social media. Do you think there is enough awareness of these among the public at large? And if not, what might be some ways in which negative effects can be more widely recognized? Niam or Isaac?
So I could take it, I think one way is through platforms like this. I'm very happy that you're doing this. I think it's going to help a lot of people to create awareness. And maybe if they take it seriously enough, we can look at it as even like a public health issue, and talk about it the same way. For example, we talk about anorexia. To create awareness among parents, because most of us are really busy with our everyday life, and we trust the society and the norms to guide our decisions. Whereas in some cases, especially if the phenomenon is very new, the norms may not necessarily be the best way to go. So I think platforms like this is good. Creating public health. I don't want to call it an emergency, but public health initiatives that are going to create awareness among school parents and small communities, and finally it will cascade to larger scale awareness campaigns.
Yeah, I totally agree with Niam. I think the more we talk about it and the more we discuss it and bring it into our life, it's again in the same way, like a lot of these problems or challenges for the society didn't go away immediately. So we need a long-term conversation. We just have to keep it going until we get to a point that we reach to a balance. And I think we are in that process.
All right, we have time for just one last question. And this one, Larry, is for you. After this very thoughtful discussion with Isaac and Niam, do you feel more concerned than before about negative effects of social media, or do you feel there is sufficient recognition of the issues and a path to mitigating them in the future?
No, I'm not assuaged by this. I'm fearful of it. I don't think there's enough awareness. I kind of agree with Niam that platforms like this, and by the way, we're willing to sell it to the University of Miami. I'm sure an arrangement can be made, but I don't think there's enough awareness, especially on behalf of parents of young children. I see some of the statistics about lifestyle, of unhappiness among kids, about bullying, about anorexia, and I'm not happy with what I'm seeing. I think we're only at the first layer of this, and I think it's good that people like Leon and Isaac are involved in this and publishing on this, to make the public aware of what actually is going on.
All right, we are out of time, and I want to thank all three of you for a really compelling discussion. Next month, on October 11th, we'll have a webinar that has a very different focus. It's on corporate taxes, corporations that pay very low taxes. They do so legally. They're working within the letter of the law, but the question is, should they be focusing on the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law? So that's for next month. And I want to thank you again, Niam, Isaac, and Larry, for a really, really interesting discussion.
Thank you for having me.
So much, yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Isaac. Appreciate it.
Goodbye.